it's Tucker again. Going through today's cases made me question, what is it about a "do not enter" sign in a zoo that makes someone think it doesn't apply to them? From a nutritionist who ignored her lane to hand-feed a hippo, to a man trying to test his alpha status in front of a hyena pack, only to be humbled in the bloodiest way possible. It was July 23rd, 2016. What no one recorded that Sunday afternoon at the municipal zoo outside Missouri was the precise moment the junior keeper stopped arguing, because that was the moment Jael Vardhan decided she knew better than everyone who had tried to warn her. Jael was 41, a nutrition specialist who had once worked at a larger wildlife park in Pune, until an elephant calf died from an intestinal infection she reportedly dismissed as temporary digestive stress. After internal criticism and a demotion, she landed at this struggling municipal zoo. Staff quietly mocked her habit of calling herself an animal empath. She had begun publicly hand-feeding 2 adult hippos during visitor hours, insisting the animals ate calmer when trust was involved. Keepers repeatedly reminded her that the feeding mesh existed because hippos became unpredictable during food competition. She ignored them. On this crowded Sunday, her goal was simple: prove her method worked. I think she genuinely believed her soothing voice and fruit slices could override millions of years of evolution. The problem was that belief never required her to be right, only stubborn. She had walked into the restricted secondary service lane beside the holding moat, carrying 2 buckets of watermelon and pumpkin slices. A junior keeper argued with her near the gate, but several visitors already had their phones out because she was loudly explaining that fear-based zoo policies caused aggression. Likely in her mind, the crowd was her audience, and the hippos were props. The keeper's voice had risen, then just stopped. He retreated toward the outer service corridor while continuing radio calls for emergency containment staff. I think that was the moment she felt victorious. Jael crouched beside the concrete edge, talking toward the crowd instead of monitoring the animals. The nearer hippo, the one from the channel, began moving toward her. Not fast, a slow, deliberate glide. She reached down with both hands holding fruit out flat. The hippo's mouth opened wide. In my opinion, she never saw the subtle shift in its posture and forward acceleration because she was smiling at a tourist's toddler. The hippo surged forward out of the water channel and bit across her torso. Witnesses described a sound like wet branches snapping. Her left forearm was partially crushed and nearly torn away below the elbow during the second thrash, as the animal pinned her against the concrete moat wall and jerked its head violently from side to side. She screamed, trying to sound something out, and then the second hippo joined the attack within seconds, crushing her pelvis while she was still intermittently conscious after the initial bite. Visitors' footage showed her disappearing beneath the hippo's body for almost 30 seconds at a time, while people screamed and staff ordered the crowd away from the barriers. Another keeper tried distracting the animals with hoses and loud banging, but the hippos did not release. A ticketing clerk called emergency services, but staff could not safely retrieve her until the animals were locked away. When they finally reached her, it was too late. The cause of death was hemorrhagic shock. The zoo temporarily suspended public feeding demonstrations. Jael's former zoo in Pune released no statement. I think about the junior keeper who stepped back. He quit within a month. I also can't understand ignoring so many warnings. That's not empathy. That's stupidity with an audience. So that was a classic case of ego over instincts. And speaking of ignoring obvious danger because you think you know better, it was September 12, 2017, at a small crocodile park on the humid outskirts of Davao, Philippines. Before the park gates locked, one man climbed down into a concrete-lined enclosure to pull a stranger to safety. It might look heroic, but think again. Ramil Toring was 33 years old, a former army serviceman who had left the military under circumstances no one at the park asked about. He worked overnight security, 6 nights a week, living alone in a rented room behind a tire shop. Near closing time, he had been watching the final handful of visitors filter toward the exit when a drunk man in sandals stepped over a waist-high rail and crossed a faded secondary rope barrier installed several feet back from the waterline. Rommel saw the visitor slip down a sloped concrete embankment toward a shallow crocodile exhibit. The emergency alarm was mounted on a post beside the gate, clearly marked. He did not pull it. Instead, he handed his flashlight to another guard and muttered something about handling it before management made drama, heard by nearby tourists. His logic was understandable, even flawed. An alarm meant paperwork, a formal incident report, maybe a write-up. Now, I might be wrong, but his ego probably played a bigger part than his army service in why he ran toward danger instead of away from it. Military training might teach you to act fast, but ego tells you that you're always the exception, even in a place with its own rules and protocols. The enclosure held 2 saltwater crocodiles, both roughly 9 feet long, animals the staff incorrectly believed were less active near closing because they often remained motionless during evening hours. But the air was warm, and the animals had been fed 2 days prior. The feeding routine had conditioned them to associate movement near the feeding side of the enclosure with activity. The visitor, knee-deep in muddy water, froze when the first crocodile turned its head. Ramil climbed down the embankment without a pole, radio, or bait stick. He reached the man's shirt collar and began pulling upward. The embankment was slick with algae. A witness, a concession worker packing up a food stall, later said Ramil's left foot slipped on the submerged concrete just as the man's weight shifted. He fell backward into deeper water near the feeding zone. The first crocodile seized his right leg just above the knee. The sound, the worker said, was a wet impact followed by a scream that changed pitch instantly. The crocodile twisted hard as it pulled backward, dragging Ramil partially beneath the surface. Ramil yelled for the alarm only after he lost his grip on the visitor, and the second crocodile surged in from deeper water, clamping onto his upper shoulder and chest area. The visitor scrambled out on his own, clawing up the embankment and running past the entrance gate without looking back. Ramil was dragged beneath the surface once, then pulled sideways through the water in violent bursts as both crocodiles thrashed near the feeding area. Witnesses later said his movements became weaker after the second submersion. The concession worker ran to the alarm post and activated it approximately 40 seconds after the screaming began. Animal control staff arrived 6 minutes later with catch poles and control shields. By then, the water near the feeding zone had turned dark red, and Ramil was unresponsive. They drove him to a hospital, but he died en route. The coroner's findings, in plain terms, described catastrophic blood loss from a severed femoral artery. I think the army taught him that hesitation kills, but it never taught him that some alarms exist, because even the best soldier can't fight a crocodile alone. Ramil's family received a small death benefit. No one from the army attended the funeral, which tells a lot. And speaking of overconfidence, meet the man who turned his back on a bear for a cigarette pack. It was May 15, 2015, at a wildlife park on the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh City, where a cigarette pack and a lazy afternoon would become the least peaceful ending a young man could script for himself. Kien Phuoc was 26, a motorbike repairman from Bien Hoa. He had a reputation among co-workers for loud jokes and a need to be the center of any gathering. That afternoon, he had joined 3 colleagues for a rare day trip to the park. His stated goal was to film something that would finally get shared beyond his usual circle. I think stupid bravado is just fear dressed up as confidence, and this might sound mean, but knowing the ending to this story, Kien seemed to have been wearing that outfit for years. He spent nearly an hour complaining that the sun bears looked dead inside, prodding at the enclosure's outer fence, and making loud remarks about how a real animal would have more fight. An attractive female tourist leaned too far over the waist-high guest barrier while trying to photograph the bears and dropped a cigarette pack into the dry moat below. Kien saw it immediately. He announced he would retrieve it, winked at the woman, and told nearby tourists the bear was too fat and lazy to move fast. None of the park staff were close enough to hear him before he climbed the steel safety railing mounted behind the guest barrier. The enclosure was designed with a low concrete wall topped by a metal rail with warning signs in Vietnamese and English posted every few yards along the perimeter, then a 15-foot drop into a dry moat where the bears spent most of their time. Kien swung one leg over the top rail, lowered himself down the concrete face using the support posts, and dropped onto the packed dirt. The sun bear, a middle-aged female weighing roughly 110 pounds, stayed still beneath a shaded concrete shelter. Her head turned once, then settled. Kien walked to the cigarette pack, picked it up, and held it overhead like a trophy. He turned his back completely to wave at his friends and the small crowd gathering at the rail. The moment he turned around was the moment he stopped being a person and became a target. The bear sprinted from the shelter with a sudden, flat-footed speed that made several witnesses gasp. She struck him between the shoulders hard enough to drive his face into the dirt. His legs kicked once, twice. Before he could push up, the bear bit into the back of his neck and began dragging him toward the shelter. He screamed. The sound was high and continuous, not like a movie scream, but like someone trying to inhale and yell at the same time. He still held the selfie stick in his right hand and tried to swing it toward the bear's face. The bear clamped down on his forearm above the wrist, crushing the bones and peeling back tissue as she shook her head, and the stick fell. Witnesses later described the cracking noise of bone as the bear shifted higher and bit repeatedly into the side and back of his head while pulling him across the dirt. A park staff member at the nearby ticket booth heard the commotion and alerted emergency. The tranquilizer equipment was stored in a locked shed on the opposite side of the park. Staff needed nearly 9 minutes to reach the enclosure, prepare the dart, and get into position. Kian stopped moving before the bear was even sedated. The animal released him only after the dart took effect, and she retreated to the shelter. A park medic confirmed no signs of life before paramedics arrived. The coroner's report described death due to cervical spinal fracture and traumatic asphyxiation from sustained pressure to the neck, with additional massive soft tissue loss to the scalp and left forearm. The female tourist whose cigarette pack started the chain left before police finished interviewing witnesses and was never publicly identified. Was the showboating worth it? At least he learned, though too late, that bears aren't lazy. Meanwhile, another lesson was delivered in Bangladesh, this time about chimps. It was June 15, 2018, at a zoo in Chattogram, Bangladesh, where a privileged teenager who had never been told no finally met a consequence that couldn't be bought or settled behind closed doors. Naeem Rafi, 18, came from a wealthy Dhaka family known for quietly resolving incidents involving him. Schoolmates described him as destructive and impossible to discipline. He had been removed from 2 private schools after vandalism and assaults, but his parents' influence erased the paper trail each time. I think this is what happens when money replaces parenting for long enough. The child stops believing any wall can hold. The June trip to the zoo was framed as a casual outing, but Naeem had brought 2 friends. The afternoon already started with warnings. Naeem spent hours pounding on the chimpanzee viewing glass while filming reaction clips. Staff told him to stop after one chimp began charging the barrier repeatedly. Naeem mocked the animal loudly, slapping the glass inches from its face while his friends laughed. He was escorted away from the immediate enclosure viewing zone after repeated warnings. That should have been the end of it, but Naeem had never respected a boundary he didn't break. That night, he returned with the same 2 friends after gaining unauthorized access to the holding area, which authorities later determined involved bribery. Security footage later showed Naeem shirtless, entering a corridor with a malfunctioning lock system, leading adjacent to the indoor chimp night holding area observation space just after midnight. He was pretending to beat his chest. His friends recorded from a raised maintenance walkway overlooking the enclosure perimeter as he yelled toward the dark interior. The dominant male chimpanzee attacked almost immediately after becoming fully visually engaged with the intrusion. Witness audio captured the shift. Naeem's taunt cut off mid-syllable, replaced by a wet, percussive impact as the animal tackled him backward onto concrete. His friends saw the chimp's teeth closing over Naeem's face first, a single wrenching motion that tore away his nose and lower lip, leaving a dark cavity where his mouth had been. He tried to raise his arms. The chimp grabbed his left hand and crushed the fingers in a rapid gripping motion resulting in multiple fractures, each impact audible across the enclosure as a sharp crack. Naeem crawled toward the fence, leaving a wet trail across the floor. The chimp stomped on his leg twice, then dragged him back by the ankle. Luckily, only the dominant chimp was physically present in the accessible enclosure space due to standard separation housing of multiple individuals in adjacent secured enclosures. However, it was enough. A janitor making rounds near the reptile house heard the screaming roughly 3 minutes after the attack began and contacted zoo security. Responders arrived about 8 minutes after that, but Naeem was already unresponsive from blood loss and severe cranial trauma. The cause of death was exsanguination combined with traumatic brain injury. The maintenance worker who accepted the bribe lost his job immediately after investigation. Unsurprisingly, the local news coverage focused more on the parents' failed attempts to suppress the story and their influence over local officials than on the animal attack itself. I think that tells you everything about what actually killed Naeem. Not the chimp, but 18 years of being told he could do anything without ever hearing the word no. The chimpanzee was just the first thing that didn't care about his last name. Now for the next story. Our next victim really thought tigers cared about her healing vibes. It was February 15, 2014, at a private safari park outside Bogor, Indonesia, where a woman who believed she could speak the language of predators walked into a cage she was never meant to enter. Newsflash, the tiger inside had no interest in conversation. Melati Sirigar was 29 years old and sold online sessions in animal energy healing, claiming she could calm aggressive wildlife through posture and intention. She had no formal training in zoology or animal behavior. Her reputation among local exotic pet forums was a mix of devoted followers and skeptical keepers who called her a liability. She had arrived that morning with 2 paying clients who believed her stories about privately interacting with rescued big cats overseas. She had spent the earlier part of the day loudly criticizing park staff for treating tigers like monsters. She told her clients that most captive big cats were just traumatized and needed confident human energy. People like these are scary. I think she genuinely believed her own hype. When staff explained the secondary barriers and warning signs, Melati waved them off, telling nearby visitors that the rules existed because most people projected fear. They were the logic of someone who had only ever practiced on domestic animals and confused luck with mastery. The enclosure was set into a hillside, with a visitor viewing platform separated by a chest-high wooden rail and a 6-foot ditch. Beyond that stood a secondary chain-link fence with a staff-only maintenance and transfer corridor gate used during scheduled animal movement lockdowns. The gate had been left improperly secured during a coordinated enclosure preparation and shift change transfer procedure. When multiple staff responsibilities briefly overlapped, Melati slipped through it while her clients filmed from behind the rail. She crouched inside the entrance, hands extended, softly calling toward a female tiger resting roughly 30 feet away on a concrete shelf. A few other visitors had gathered, some murmuring. The tiger lifted its head. It did not blink. Melati took one small step forward. The tiger charged so fast that witnesses later described it as a single brown and black blur. There was no growl, no warning slap of the tail. One witness, a park employee standing near the keeper shed, said the animal covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. It hit Melati low, shoulder into her thighs, and she went backward onto the dirt before she could raise her arms. The tiger's jaws closed around her throat while she was still falling. Believe it or not, I've seen people defend influencers like Melati by saying they meant no harm, but intent doesn't matter when a 400-pound predator doesn't interpret it that way. The tiger shook its head violently side to side. Blood sprayed across the concrete shelf. A second witness, one of her clients, later told investigators that the tiger's paws pinned Melati's shoulders while it pulled upward on her neck. Her legs kicked twice and then stopped. The tiger shifted its grip lower, clamping onto her upper chest, while visitors standing roughly 40 feet away on the viewing platform fled screaming. Several witnesses later reported vomiting near the rail. Staff was quick in response, and approximately 7 minutes passed before the tranquilizer took effect. Still, Melati was pronounced dead at the scene. The preliminary medical report listed severe laceration and near-complete disruption of the carotid arteries and jugular veins, along with cervical spine fracture and extensive soft tissue trauma to the anterior neck and thoracic cavity. Her clients deleted most promotional pages within days. Melati's family held a small private funeral and did not speak to reporters. Imagine if you were the 2 clients who paid real money to watch a woman lie to them and then watched her die for it. Dumb gurus exploit other people's stupidity, but the stupidity is a choice on both ends. She climbed the rail, they were there for it, and the tiger just did what tigers do. Now meet the drunk ex-hunting guide who thought a zoo lion would respect his ego. It was November 17, 2018, at a crowded evening event in a zoo in Guadalajara, Mexico, where a man who had spent decades staring down dangerous predators climbed a low wall and discovered that a cage changes everything. Tadeo Verastegui, 52, had once run a successful private hunting tour company in Sonora, catering to wealthy foreign clients willing to pay for the chance to kill large predators. In the months before that evening, his business collapsed after a client died during a poorly supervised lion hunt on private land. He lost permits, guides, and investors within weeks. Friends later said he became increasingly drunk and angry, spending long afternoons at bars instead of looking for work. On that Saturday, he had been drinking since early afternoon and decided to visit the zoo alone, likely because the evening event was free and the crowds offered anonymity. Needless to say, ego is the most reliable predictor of tragedy, and alcohol just removes the brakes. Let's see where this one goes. At the lion exhibit, a moat and a waist-high perimeter railing with warning signage separated guests from a resting male lion. Tadeo began boasting loudly to strangers, pointing at the animal and describing his years hunting predators in the bush. A group of younger visitors laughed at him after he claimed a lion could never take him by surprise. Witnesses later said his face changed at that moment. He climbed over the barrier and down into the decorative rock-lined moat, slurring that he had stared down lions before, and this one was just a zoo animal. After reaching the bottom, he crossed the moat floor and pulled himself over the shorter animal side containment wall. wall that separated the drainage area from the actual lion habitat. The rock surface was uneven and steep. He stumbled twice on the way down, catching himself with one hand against the concrete wall. Several people yelled at him to come back. A woman near the front told investigators she saw him turn and waved dismissively before continuing his descent. A man who has lost everything will sometimes try to reclaim his identity in the dumbest possible way, and that is exactly what happened here. The lion was resting near a rock formation approximately 15 feet from the moat floor edge of the visitor barrier zone. Tadeo approached directly, arms out, shouting. The animal initially held position, then shifted back a few feet with ears flat and body low. Some bystanders shouted and laughed nervously rather than cheering, which added to the tension rather than directly provoking the animal. That sound seemed to push him further. He waved both arms and took another step. The lion charged after the close-range threat display escalated. The distance closed in within roughly 1 to 2 seconds over a short sprint distance of under 30 feet. It hit him low in the torso, driving him backward onto the concrete. The bite came immediately into the upper chest and shoulder. The animal bit through fabric and skin without pause, then dragged him several yards by the torso. His legs scraped across the concrete. A second bite found his neck. He stopped moving moments later. A food vendor near the reptile house made the first emergency call. The lion continued tearing at his abdomen for another 30 seconds while zoo guests screamed and children were rushed toward the exit. Zoo responders arrived in roughly 4 minutes, but safety protocols delayed entry, and keepers needed 7 minutes to lure the lion into a holding corridor. He was dead by then. His former business partners did not issue a statement. The zoo installed additional barriers the following week. The line between a hunter and the hunted for this story is just a fence and a few drinks. Tadeo Verastegui crossed both without ever realizing he had already lost. If Tadeo's story is a warning about the poison of ego mixed with alcohol, this last story is the chaser, a reminder that even sober arrogance can be just as lethal. It was August 17, 2013. A man who believed himself untouchable stepped out of an SUV at an unregulated roadside zoo park outside Rustenburg. Within 90 seconds, tourists on 3 sides of him saw the exact moment his certainties became irrelevant. Pieter Naudet, 47, owned a small trucking company based in Bloemfontein and had built a reputation for dominating every room he entered, loud at industry meetings, dismissive of mechanics, proud of his physical presence. A family friend was documented to have mentioned that his family had stopped correcting him years ago. The off-route predator viewing section of the facility was loosely controlled, with staff stationed only at the main entrance checkpoint. He had spent the morning mocking other visitors who kept windows up around lions. He lowered his window and leaned out toward the enclosure. His wife reached across the center console and grabbed his forearm. He pulled his arm free without looking at her. Then he turned to the back seat where his son sat and said something that the son later described to investigators as a joke about the hyenas looking tired. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The door handle clicked twice before he pushed it open. His wife called his name, once, then again louder. He stepped out onto the dirt and left the door ajar behind him. From inside the vehicle, witnesses saw him walk 3 paces away from the SUV before he turned back to wave at his family with one hand and point at the nearest hyena with the other. Hyenas were scavengers. He had seen nature documentaries. If he showed no fear, they would retreat. His wife begged him to stop before he opened the door. His son later told investigators that Peter had called the animals oversized scavenger dogs just before stepping out. A cluster of 5 animals rested near a brush pile about 60 feet from the roadway. Other tourists had stopped their vehicles at a distance, engines running, windows sealed. Peter walked directly away from his SUV, arms spread wide, shouting. I think the adrenaline made him feel powerful for about 8 seconds. 2 hyenas lifted their heads and slunk backward into the brush. That retreat convinced him he had won. A third animal, larger and scarred across its flank, did not retreat. It circled low and fast around his blind side while another rose from the dirt and closed the distance in a half-crouch. Witnesses in 3 separate vehicles later described the same sequence to investigators. The first bite came from behind, into the back of his right calf, collapsing his leg instantly. His shout changed pitch from bravado to something else before he hit the ground. The attack escalated into multiple hyenas, biting and pulling at his legs, hips, and lower torso rather than a focused facial hold. consistent with opportunistic pack-disabling behavior. He tried dragging himself toward the SUV with his arms. The pack pulled him back. His lower right leg came nearly detached below the knee as two animals tugged in opposite directions. Armed rangers arrived approximately 5 minutes later and fired warning shots, dispersing the pack. Peter was already unconscious. They dragged him onto a stretcher tarp and loaded him into the back of a response vehicle. The vehicle drove 17 minutes to the nearest clinic in Rustenburg, where a doctor pronounced him dead on arrival. A layman's summary of the coroner's findings attributed the death on fatal blood loss from multiple deep tissue injuries, extensive organ damage to the abdominal cavity, and catastrophic trauma consistent with repeated predatory biting rather than a single focal kill strike. The park increased ranger patrols and predator zones for the following month. After the attack, Peter's wife and son returned to Bloemfontein in stunned silence, unable to process how a man who had commanded every room could not command a single moment of restraint. His funeral was sparsely attended, with only a handful of relatives and former colleagues, as many who knew him confessed privately that they had come more to support his family than to mourn his loss. In my opinion, Peter's death was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of mistaking arrogance for courage, and the real sorrow belongs to the family who had to watch him prove that even hyenas don't respect a man who refuses to respect the wild.